Yes, the presentation I'm going to talk about is a planned city with planned culture, interferences of urbanism and cultural policy in Salgótarján during the Kádár era. And so it won't be only urbanism, but also a lot of cultural policy of the city. And the once industrial town of Salgótarján is located in the north of Hungary, close to the Slovakian border. Nowadays, it is a city with a shrinking population. It shrinked from 50,000 to 35,000 after the change, and with a high unemployment rate. In many cases, its name triggers some negative associations about a grayish, dull countryside town where nothing happens. In some cases, people know nothing about the city and they don't really want to change this situation. However, there was a time when Salgótarján was the synonym for constant building, progress, and for the new modern urban way of living in Hungary. In my presentation, I would like to shortly introduce the reconstruction of the city in the 1960s and 70s, which changed the former scale and atmosphere of the settlement completely. And as a result, the new model town of socialist urban planning was born, the new model of the Kádár era, differing from the industrial towns of the 50s, planned and built according to the principles of socialist realism. Yes, here's another picture. Salgótarján was among the first experiments to create a city in the style of socialist modernism in Hungary, and according to the general and professional opinion of that time, the experiment turned out great. Apart from introducing the architectural developments, I would like to demonstrate how the utopic idea to create the ideal socialist city also meant to create the ideal inhabitant of this city, to shape its identity and consciousness. The leaders of Salgótarján thought that culture is essential for a real city. Without it, the newly erected buildings would only be an empty set. On the other hand, as I would later show you through some examples, they regarded the newly gained architectural quality of their city, and especially of the city center, which you can see here, as a catalyst for other cultural activities, and also as a strict standard that other areas of life should reach. The reigning power connected the notion of progress to these kind of towns and used various methods to achieve that the urbanizing masses would as soon as possible embrace the identity of the town dweller. Decisions of cultural policy served a double aim: to shape the taste of working class inhabitants and to strengthen the local identity, as a lot of people were settling down in these decades from other parts of the country. Yes, and I will examine the interferences of urbanism and cultural politics through three case studies: the possible roles of artists in the town, the significance of sculptures on public squares, and the representation of Salgótarján at the Venice Biennial in 1976. The processes of urbanism and cultural politics are, of course, also characteristics of some other Hungarian cities, and I think also some other cities in the region, but they were present in Salgótarján in such a concentrated way that I think it's a good example, and we can regard the city as a model of these processes. Yes, this is how it looked like in the turn of the century. So Salgótarján's growth began with coal mining in the second half of the 19th century, and by the early 20th century, it already had a differentiated industry based on the local coal. Steel and glass production and the factory producing stoves. Actually, this is the only one still working quite well. It officially became a town in 1922. Its first major, Kálmán Förster, erected some new official buildings, but the city still looked more like a huge village with small one-level buildings and poor infrastructure. At that time, it had a population around a bit more than 10,000 people. Yes. And after, this is another picture. And although in 1950 it became, for political and symbolical reasons, the seat of Nógrád County, instead of Balassagyarmat, a town with rich bourgeois traditions. The general character of the city didn't change much. Only some apartment buildings, a department store, and a council house were built. Here you can see this is the council house at the lower part, and this is the warehouse, or department store, sorry. And in the second half, this is the council house of the Nógrád County. And in the second half of the 1950s, after the revolution, the long-time planned reconstruction of the old city started to be realized. This city had a lot of industrial workers pending from the neighboring settlements, and the living conditions of its inhabitants were very unsatisfactory, so they needed a lot of new blocks of houses. The city was also not able to fulfill its duties as seat of the county, with the infrastructure inherited from the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Salgótarján is located in a valley. Actually, this is a drawing by József Finta, an architect who was part of reconstructing the city. So the ways to expand the town were quite limited, and also the railway cut the city into two. So it was not so easy to find new territories to work on. So to gain territory for the new buildings, the city council and the architects decided to demolish the old city almost completely and replace it phase by phase with a new one. The process of the reconstruction lasted for more than 2 decades until the end of the 80s. But the first 10 years were the most intense, and from an urbanistic point of view, the most remarkable. The first step was to find a location to the new main square, clean it from the old buildings, and then build the most iconic buildings of the town, which then acted as an epicenter of transformation and marked the beginning of a new era. And this is where they find the location for this new main square. Actually, it's opposite the older main square. And you will see on the next image how they changed this. So this is the place which had all the buildings on it on the previous picture. And this is the building process of the new main square. It was built between 1959 and the end of the 60s. So by 68 it was all ready. And the planning of the city center was the work of Géza Magyar, and the architect György Jánosi designed a huge hotel, the Karancs, that building, the vertical one, located on the main square. It was the first realized building of the new ensemble, started in 1959, and it opened to the public in 1964. Its monumental form and the use of raw, reinforced concrete surfaces on the facade stood out at once from the rest of the city's fabric. By 1968, it was accompanied by György Strock's House of Culture. So this is the house of... sorry, it's not visible on this picture, but I will show you some images later. And József Finta's Pécskő department store. It is the flat one on the middle of the picture. And Géza Magyar's huge 8-floor block of flats, the L-shaped building. The buildings corresponded to each other's measures and played with horizontal and vertical forms. Still keeping the representative function of main squares built in the 50s, and being able to host political celebrations, this square could serve as the meeting point for the inhabitants of the city and served more diverse purposes like living, shopping, and spending their free time. Yes, and so here are some more images. This is the other facade of the Hotel Karancs, and there's the city center, the cultural center to the right of it. And this is just a panoramic view of the city. And you can see that it was only the first phase of reconstruction, and then in the following 2 decades, other parts of the city were reconstructed as well. And yes, this is the Karancs Hotel and the Cultural Center. It was taken in the 70s, this photograph. So you can see how it looked apart from the building materials and with some plants on it. Yeah, and this was taken by a guest of the Karancs Hotel. So this is a bird view of the main square. And I just show you quickly some interior designs of these buildings to see how richly they were decorated and how prestigious they were. And these are going to be interiors of the hotel. And actually, I think it's important to emphasize that the hotel was from the very beginning a bit oversized for the city. So it was too big to host tourists. Mostly it hosted delegations from friendly countries from the Eastern Bloc, and who were brought there by buses to see this new progressive city. And later it also served as a student or a workers' hostel when it was already almost closed down. Yeah, and this is the bar, and this is the... Actually, almost all of the inside decorations were destroyed, and this piece by Kálmán Csohány was rescued, and now it's in a small museum of Csohány, a few villages away from Salgótarján, but they really rescued it in the last moment. And yes, this is the restaurant. Actually, the restaurant was a very important meeting point for the citizens. And now that it's gone, they don't really have something which could fill this void. So everybody had very good memories of this restaurant. And yeah, this is just the design of And yeah, this is how it looked during the night with all the lamps. And yeah. And this is the interior of the cultural center. And it also has a huge mosaic decoration. Luckily, it's on its original place and it's in a good condition. Yes, and this is how József Finta's Pécskő department store looked from the other side. He really wanted to make a connection between the different buildings with this 3-step horizontal building to connect different parts of the square. And yes, and Géza Magyar's building with its balconies wanted to create connection with the facade of the Karancs Hotel, I think quite successfully. And yeah, and although the whole era was characterized by a constant lack of flats, and therefore prefabricated system building became the number one solution of the housing crisis, architectural debates forecasted the problems with this kind of characterless, monotone housing blocks early on. In Salgótarján, at least during the 60s and early 70s, the architects, Géza Magyar and József Finta, who were planning the urban structure, aimed to build a diverse set of apartment buildings which had some unique character. In the beginning, the quality of these houses were quite good, and the city could use these new flats to attract intellectuals and professional workforces to the town. Yes, and here are just some examples on what kind of buildings they planned to Salgótarján. Yes, and this is another view taken in the 80s. Yes, and it's really important to emphasize that the improvement of the city was used for ideological purposes. So maybe I can answer the question of what was socialist about it now, because its former city structure, what I showed in the beginning, its bad quality houses, its neo-Baroque public buildings were identified as tools for oppressing the working class, and the reigning power extuberated the local labor movement narrative, especially the role of one certain partisan group. And so they regarded the realization of the new city center as historical justice to the working class. And of course, the new buildings also stood for modernity, progress, and showed that a socialist country is capable to realize even such pretentious visions. Yes, here it was taken before the last part of this modernist city was built in the second part of the 80s. Yes, and this is actually a prefabricated housing block there. So it also appeared in Salgótarján, but at the edge of the city, not in the city center. But they couldn't avoid it, actually. Yes. As I mentioned before, the visually sophisticated architectural environment was regarded as a catalyst of further development, especially in the transformation into a real city. I forgot one building. It is the museum. It was built in 1980, and it has a very special staircase. And then I will move on to the official artists of the town. So, they thought that the built environment was not enough in itself to achieve this idealistic city they had in their mind. And from 1963 on, the city council started to plan the population of the city more consciously. The majority of the inhabitants at that time were trained and general laborers, and the renewal of factories, the reconstruction works, and the tasks of public education all required competent labor forces. So they decided to publish an open call to attract 1,000 professionals to Salgótarján. Originally, they wanted to use the word intellectual, but they used instead of it professional, because the less progressive and usually not so well educated decision makers of the city insisted on using this version. The role and responsibility of a newcomer white-collar worker were disputed in several articles in the local journals. He or she had to be devoted to contribute to the public life of the city and to reflect on their privileged and important social status. As the journalist wrote in 1970, the intellectual from Nógrád should not maintain an empty lifestyle, babble bored in cafes, or think in cliches instead of having an autonomous opinion. This is the additional responsibility of the whole Hungarian intelligentsia, but it should be applied to the white collars of Tarján even more. So they had a huge responsibility on their shoulders. The new settlers were honored mainly with good quality apartments, which meant a lot at that time, for example, for a young couple or a family to settle down. A lot of them got their flats in Géza Magyar's 8th floor building on the main square. Actually, it had the best quality flats. Yes. In December 1964, the party committee of the county took a decision on developing Salgótarján to a regional cultural center in which they conceived a complex long-term concept on cultural developments. The goal was to make the cultural profile of Salgótarján suitable for a city, and to find the place and role of the town on a national scale, to find that special tone and color which is still missing from the Hungarian cultural palette. In creating this special local character, they counted on the artists living and working in Tarján, who lived and worked under improving circumstances, especially after the cultural center decision of 1964. The situation of the artists were very similar to the intellectuals. They also had special responsibilities in creating the new identity and character of Salgótarján and mediating this through their works in order to reach the local residents and the wider world, especially the visiting delegations. They regularly got artworks from these artists as present. And and they also had to shape the taste of the public, also the inhabitants of the city. They were provided excellent working conditions and various ways of maintaining a financially secure lifestyle. To give them a secure lifestyle, the city had different strategies. They launched the studio flat program, for example. They're built 4 apartments, and it was from the middle of the 60s. They provided studio flats for 4 artists, 3 local, and they published an open call in Hungarian newspapers to attract another artist to the city. And János Lóránt was the one applying. And according to art newspapers of the era, some other cities launched studio programs as well with similar goals: to have official artists in the city who can be the basis of a local cultural life and depict the production and the life in the town. But Salgótarján was among the first cities to launch such a program. The artists, on this picture are actually the 2 most important ones, Ferenc Inke and János Lóránt on the 2 sides. So the local artists taught drawing in schools, or if it was too tiring for them, the city provided other opportunities to them to make a living. The city council and the local factories provided commissioned artworks and prizes for them. And so they thought that the building of the modern city and the industrial work and all the factories were actually in the fabric of the city. So they were integral part of the city. They were not separated somewhere else. So the city suggested these topics for the artists, and they really wanted the artists to depict this constant building and production and this bustling life of the socialist city. And here are just some examples of, this is Ferenc Inke's work about construction, and this is another piece about construction site near the main square. And this will be the most terrible one, I think. It's the birth of Salgótarján. It's a very symbolic vision. I don't know what the Venus of Willendorf has to do with it. It's this is a mosaic piece from the Karancs Hotel by Zizi Makris, and it also depicted in a more abstract way the construction works. And there was a very special way of making a living for the artists, and actually to take part in public education of the workers. And it was the system of the socialist contracts between the artists and the factories. And in the beginning, also the artists and the factories thought that it's like a forced marriage, as contemporary sources say, but then they figured out how to work with each other, and it varied from factory and to artists what kind of cooperation they used. And some artists just went there to educate the workers. They had drawing courses, or they went together to museums. and in exchange the factory provided them some money, or for example the glass factory provided glass for framing the pictures or things like that. But the interesting thing was that in some cases, for example in the case of, this is for example the glass factory workers, so they really needed this kind of skills actually for their work. And so in some cases this cooperation went further and it really had a new quality, I think. For example, some artists even started to make artworks inside the factories from the material that was produced there. For example, Ferenc Cinque produced enamel works on huge plates used for the stoves, actually, to the stove plates, and it was burnt out in the factory with the help of the workers, so they could assist to the birth of an artwork, and it really meant a more informal way of being together or to exchange ideas. So in some cases it went beyond these formalities, I think. And I think that what is also important in the socialist contracts is that in that time official artists were really looking for ways to be or to produce socialist artworks in content, but not to be very schematic, or because it was really exploited by socialist realism, the whole topic of industrial work and the figure of the worker. And some told, after working for years or for decades in these socialist contracts, that now they have a more honest approach to this industrial work topic, and then maybe they could depict it in another way. And the city regarded actually the workers as the new supporters of art, like they were the mecenas of artists, or it was propagated that they are. So the artists really had to do pieces for them, and they should please the workers, and they had to make pieces that are approachable for the workers and easily understandable. Yes, and actually that's all I wanted to say about the artists of the town, but it's very important that these are only the official artists of the town. So of course there were some who were not so well behaved, and they had their conflicts with the regime, of course. Yes, and another important part where urbanism and cultural policy met were the question of public sculptures. Salgótarján had a very good vertical network, so it had a lot of public sculptures on public squares by leading sculptors of the era, like József Somogyi or Imre Varga. Actually, this is a sculpture called The Town. So it was a monument for the town itself, and it was, of course, put in context of the main square, and it had light bulbs in it, and it could be it glow in the dark. Of course, now it's not in such a good condition. And yes, they thought that sculptures on public squares are a very good way to educate people or to emancipate them, because yes, they see these sculptures anyway, so they just couldn't avoid them. And this is why they thought that it's really, really important to choose carefully what to put on the public squares. And in this case, the built environment was even more important, as a standard to hit. And they always compared the new sculptures of the time to the architecture, if it could be successful enough to hit this standard or not. And in the summer of 1971, Salgótarján launched an annual exhibition program. It was organized every year after that. It was an open-air sculpture exhibition, and in this case, it really was even more harmonized with this built environment. All the sculptures were put in this raster on the main square, and people thought that it's actually a really good way of trying if a monumental work will be good enough on its future destination place, because this environment is so perfect. Then if a sculpture works here, then it will work also elsewhere, and if it fails here, then maybe it's not a good sculpture at all. Yes, and here are, and it actually, first it was a very important event. They invited artists from all over Hungary, and also the Kunsthalle from Budapest was a co-organizer. But after the 70s, it became less and less important, and it became a regional event. And also in the 80s, some smaller pieces were stolen, but it couldn't be reported because it would harm the city's name, and the transporting of these heavy statues actually destroyed the stone surface of the square, so it was a bit reaching its end. Yeah. Yes, it's another example. And actually these sculpture exhibitions existed until the early 2000s, and then it ceased because of financial reasons. But yeah, in the 60s and 70s, it was very typical that cities, countryside towns launched this kind of event only specific for them to gain attraction. For example, in Pécs, they had the theater festival. In Miskolc, they had the biennial for graphic works. So it was each city chose something for themselves. Yeah, and then really shortly, because I'm running out of time. It's just very strange that in 1976, Salgótarján was presented at the Venice Biennial, actually at the real Venice, so not the architectural one, but and in that year the key word was ambiente. So they transported some material from Salgótarján and from another small town called Szentendre. It's quite close to Budapest, and it's a perfect tourist destination, a small Baroque town. And it also has a lot of ongoing artistic tradition with art colonies, and they wanted to show how the characteristics of a city affected the works of art produced there, and of course they wanted to show that besides progress, they are also protecting other values, if it's valuable enough, because in the case of Salgótarján it wasn't. And this is just one piece that was shown there. It's János Lórenc painting, and the title is Moving to a New Flat. So yeah, and so nowadays, as I mentioned in the foreword, the city is struggling with its identity and actually struggling for their daily life because there's no jobs at all, and it's a really poor region actually. and all the industry collapsed actually, or almost all the industry collapsed after the change, because the coal mines were running out, and also privatization was not so successful. And so nowadays people have very ambiguous feelings towards this socialist past. For example, if you tell them that, can you tell me something about this socialist city, they will cast a curse on you or something. So they are not really happy with this label, for example. And for example, the way they handle their public sculptures is very interesting, because they removed this one. It was a partisan sculpture, and they replaced it with this very conservative country flag, which is a replica of a monument from the interwar period, from the Horthy regime. And they moved some. They have a sculpture park which has around 5 or 6 sculptures, and they just stand there. And he's my favorite. He's some party member, I think. And but, for example, opposite the main square, they left a monument which is very political and connected to this era. It's a monument for the Räterepublik, how do you yes, in 1919. So, and they left it there, although it's also stylistically very much connected to this era. And now they erect monuments for example, for the first mayor between the 2 world wars, but they created this ambient for him, which evokes the forms of the modern city. So it's a totally mixed way of remembering the past, I think. Yes, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. So, just in the context of Sharka and Jaro's presentation, I know what's going to be my target of my next weekend recreation. So, I think that it's really worth of seeing this city of Salgótarján. So now we also have time for some questions. So, okay, so first here.
You mentioned that the erection of New Salgótarján was a gesture of domination against another, an old town, an old bourgeois town. What happened to this? What was the other town? What was the enemy? And what happened to this dominated other town? Because as in East Germany, we have several such examples, like Neubrandenburg or Suhl, and after the change, these connections between the old and the new has been turned to the old state, and all these, especially these new demonstration gestures, are the losers now, absolutely.
So the other city is called Balassagyarmat. So and it still exists. I mean, it still has its own traditions, and it's very proud of its traditions.
Does it survive?
Yes, and actually they are rivaling with each other all the time. So, for example, the last time there was a decision hanging in the air about moving back the county state seat to Balassagyarmat. It was, I think, 1 or 2 years ago. So after some recent elections, they were thinking about this. So it's always hanging in the air, actually. And so it's. I think it's not a finished story yet. But if the county seat would move away from Salgótarján, I think it would be a disaster for the town, because it means a lot of workplaces. And I mean, Balassagyarmat, actually it's in a better condition, because it wasn't so artificially pumped, so to say, to grow too big, or it always had to act for their own survival. So, and it always had some bourgeoisie. So the problem of Salgótarján always has been that the majority of its inhabitants were heavy industrial workers, and the intellectuals always left the town after a while. And this is why the city really wanted to make these progresses, to settle down some inhabitants who are not only trained workers and who could sustain the city, I think. But it kind of failed, actually.
Can I ask exactly about this failure? Thank you for the presentation. I think it's extremely interesting to see such a huge architectural program inserted top-down on the city together with a cultural program. Everything I can think of that is similar is the opposite. The architectural program was inserted, but the cultural program was created sort of against whatever. So I have one question. How sustainable was this? Did it produce any kind of culture that actually survived until today, or it was a failure?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question, actually. I think that the culture and the urbanism really worked together, so they had similar goals, and so the cultural policy was also, I don't know, of course it acted on a local level, but it had to fit into the national cultural policy. And yeah, actually some things survived, but for example, in this stove factory working with enamel, so there's still a summer camp for artists provided by the factory, and they spend each summer a month or I don't know, 2 weeks there, and they can work in the factory, and the factory provides them material to work. But the artistic quality of the works produced there, it's not of big significance. I mean, it's a very interesting small island of this surviving structure of this socialist contract, because it's a survivor of that for sure. But it's still possible because this is the only factory still working, or yeah, one of the glass factories also works, but it really became a smaller one than it used to be. So actually, this cultural program was not really sustainable at all, because actually, I interviewed a lot of the city's recent inhabitants, and also those who already left from different age groups, and there was one woman who told me a very good metaphor to how she thinks of the city, and she told me that she always imagines Salgótarján as a plant that was artificially nurtured, and then they took away the nutrition, and then it just dries out or something. So of course some of the cultural program was initiated from on the city level or from local people, but for example, the financial support was provided because it had this very specific role in the country, and they really wanted to show that it is an exemplary town. So they supported these activities, and once it changed, the political situation and the economical situation, it couldn't sustain itself. So yeah. The bigger problem is that there's really no jobs at all, so everybody leaves. So this way it's really hard to convince someone to stay there and do there something, because they just couldn't make a living. And yeah, so this is the main problem actually now. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk, and especially thank you for these nice images, pictures with Juhász. One comment, one question. The comment is about socialism. I didn't think so that being against 19th century architecture and city planning and city structure and being against poor dwellings built in this period isn't especially socialist. That's modernist view of tradition, and being against tradition, it's the general modernist view. That's only a comment. The question is about this identity creating process. You told us that after the change we know that it's failed, but these efforts show some fruits in the 80s. So was in the 80s some Salgótarján pride or identity? They said, yeah, we are Salgótarjánians.
Yes. It already started. So they already were proud of the city in the 60s and the 70s and in the 80s. Of course, they had some problems with this environment. So it's really rigid, and it's so they like it, and it really meant an improvement, for example, compared to the previous living conditions and or how the city. It wasn't a city; it was a big village, really. But when I interviewed these people, almost everybody told me that the city was not. It had no architectural value, but they could really just let that building or that park there on its place. And now people they live in a city that was totally transformed, and they have no things to attach to, or I don't know if. So, for example, a lot of people mentioned the old townhouse that maybe they could have leave it there, or the old synagogue, for example, or the old marketplace. So, of course, they were not valuable from an architectural point of view, but they had their histories, and I think that the city has now problems with this lack of histories also. Yes, and they were proud, and some are still proud, or they have a love and hate relationship with the city, I should say. I don't know if I answered your question. Okay.
Some years ago, there was a revitalization in the main square, an open space revitalization. And what is your opinion? What was the effect for the city? Was a positive effect for the mentality of the people, or nothing, or even negative?
There was a reconstruction around 2010, I think, and some parts of the main square are now in a better condition, but it's still. So, for example, there are no trees, and on the old pictures you can see that there were. I don't know when did they disappear, but the main square now is very. So you don't really want to stay there for long. It's a place to pass, I think, and. So I think in this sense they were not so successful. And for example, they changed the stones or the pavement, and on the ground. And I liked the old one better. And what else? I think that the main problem on the main square is the Karancs Hotel, which stands there empty. And in 2010, they had plans to renovate that also. There was a private investor who wanted to make a conference center and a hotel of it. And there were also plans to renovate it, but it didn't happen since then. And I think without the hotel, it's really just, it's not the same as it used to be. And there's no there's no place to sit down to spend time together. Of course, there are some benches, but it's so. For example, the lack of this restaurant or cafe that used to be in the hotel, it really. So the city really misses a place like this, and I think that if they can somehow revitalize the hotel, I don't know what would be the solution, because it's really a huge one. So it wasn't economic from the first, from the moment of its creation. So I don't know what should be the solution, but I think that it's not such a big difference between the before or after the renovation, but I don't know, it's hard to say.